Chapter 2 of the United Empire Loyalists by W. Stewart Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. Chapter 2 Loyalism in the 13 Colonies. It was a remark of John Fiske that the American Revolution was merely a phase of English party politics in the 18th century. In this view there is undoubtedly an element of truth. The Revolution was a struggle with the British Empire in which were aligned on one side the American Whigs supported by the English Whigs, and on the other side the English Tories supported by the American Tories. The leaders of the Whig party in England, Charles James Fox, Edmund Burke, Colonel Barry, the great Chatham himself, all championed the cause of the American revolutionists in the English Parliament. There were many cases of Whig officers in the English army who refused to serve against the rebels in America. General Richard Montgomery, who led the revolutionists in their attack on Quebec in 1775 and 76, furnishes the case of an English officer who, having resigned his commission, came to America and, on the outbreak of the rebellion, took service in the rebel forces. On the other hand, there were thousands of American Tories who took service under the King's banner, and some of the severest defeats which the rebel forces suffered were encountered at their hands. It would be a mistake, however, to identify too closely the parties in England with the parties in America. The old Tory party in England was very different from the so-called Tory party in America. The term Tory in America was, as a matter of fact, an epithet of derision applied by the revolutionists to all who opposed them. The opponents of the revolutionists called themselves not Tories, but Loyalists or friends of government. There were, it is true, among the Loyalists not a few who held language that smacked of Toryism. Among the Loyalist pamphleteers there were those who preached the doctrine of passive obedience and non-resistance. Thus the Reverend Jonathan Boucher, a clergyman of Virginia, wrote, "Having then, my brethren, thus long been tossed to and fro in a wearisome circle of uncertain traditions, or in speculations and projects still more uncertain concerning government, what better can you do than, following the Apostles' advice, to submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the King as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well? For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the King." Jonathan Boucher subscribed to the doctrine of the divine right of kings. "Copying after the fair model of heaven itself, wherein there was government even among the angels, the families of the earth were subjected to rulers, at first set over them by God. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. The first father was the first king. Hence it is that our Church, in perfect conformity with the doctrine here inculcated, in her explication of the fifth commandment, from the obedience due to parents, wisely derives the congenial duty of honoring the king and all that are put in authority under him." Dr. Miles Cooper, the president of King's College, took up similar ground. God, he said, established the laws of government, ordained the British power, and commanded all to obey authority. "The laws of heaven and earth forbade rebellion. To threaten open disrespect of government was an unpardonable crime. The principles of submission and obedience to lawful authority were religious duties." But even Jonathan Boucher and Miles Cooper did not apply these doctrines without reserve. They both upheld the sacred right of petition and remonstrance. "It is your duty," wrote Boucher, "to instruct your members to take all the constitutional means in their power to obtain redress." Both he and Cooper deplored the policy of the British ministry. Cooper declared the Stamp Act to be contrary to American rights. He approved of the opposition to the duties on the enumerated articles, and he was inclined to think the duty on tea dangerous to constitutional liberty. It may be confidently asserted that the great majority of the American Loyalists, in fact, did not approve of the course pursued by the British government between 1765 and 1774. They did not deny its legality, but they doubted as a rule either its wisdom or its justice. Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts, one of the most famous and most hated of the Loyalists, went to England, if we are to believe his private letters, with the secret ambition of obtaining the repeal of the act which closed Boston Harbor. Joseph Galloway, another of the Loyalist leaders, and the author of the last serious attempt at conciliation, actually sat in the First Continental Congress, which was called with the object of obtaining the redress of what Galloway himself described as the grievances justly complained of. Still more instructive is the case of Daniel Delaney of Maryland. Delaney, one of the most distinguished lawyers of his time, was, after the Declaration of Independence, denounced as a Tory. His property was confiscated, and the safety of his person imperiled. Yet at the beginning of the Revolution he had been found in the ranks of the Whig pamphleteers, and no more damaging attack was ever made on the policy of the British government than that contained in his Considerations on the Propriety of Imposing Taxes in the British Colonies. When the elder Pitt attacked the Stamp Act in the House of Commons in January 1766, he borrowed most of his argument from this pamphlet, which had appeared 3 months before. This difficulty which many of the Loyalists felt with regard to the justice of the position taken up by the British government greatly weakened the hands of the Loyalist party in the early stages of the Revolution. It was only as the Revolution gained momentum that the party grew in vigour and numbers. A variety of factors contributed to this result. In the first place there were the excesses of the revolutionary mob. When the mob took to sacking private houses, driving clergymen out of their pulpits, and tarring and feathering respectable citizens, there were doubtless many law-abiding people who became Tories in spite of themselves. Later on, the methods of the inquisitorial communities possibly made Tories out of some who were the victims of their attentions. The outbreak of armed rebellion must have shocked many into a reactionary attitude. It was of these that a Whig satirist wrote, quoting, "This word, rebellion, hath frozen them up, like fish in a pond." But the event which brought the greatest reinforcement to the Loyalist ranks was the Declaration of Independence. 6 months before the Declaration of Independence was passed by the Continental Congress, the Whig leaders had been almost unanimous in repudiating any intention of severing the connection between the mother country and the colonies. Benjamin Franklin told Lord Chatham that he had never heard in America one word in favour of independence from any person, drunk or sober. Jonathan Boucher says that Washington told him in the summer of 1775 that if ever I heard of his joining in any such measures, I had his leave to set him down for everything wicked. As late as Christmas Day, 1775, the Revolutionary Congress of New Hampshire officially proclaimed their disavowal of any purpose aiming at independence. Instances such as these could be reproduced indefinitely. When, therefore, the Whig leaders in the summer of 1776 made their right about face with regard to independence, it is not surprising that some of their followers fell away from them. Among these were many who were heartily opposed to the measures of the British government, and who had even approved of the policy of armed rebellion, but who could not forget that they were born British subjects. They drank to the toast, "My country, may she always be right, but right or wrong, my country." Other motives influenced the growth of the Loyalist party. There were those who opposed the Revolution because they were dependent on government for their livelihood. Royal office holders and Anglican clergymen, for instance. There were those who were Loyalists because they thought they had picked the winning side, such as the man who candidly wrote from New Brunswick in 1788, "I have made one great mistake in politics, for which reason I never intend to make so great a blunder again." Many espoused the cause because they were natives of the British Isles and had not become thoroughly saturated with American ideas. Of the claimants for compensation before the Royal Commissioners after the war, almost two-thirds were persons who had been born in England, Scotland, or Ireland. In some of the colonies the struggle between Whig and Tory followed older party lines. This was especially true in New York, where the Livingston or Presbyterian party became Whig and the Delancey or Episcopalian party Tory. Curiously enough, the cleavage in many places followed religious lines. The members of the Church of England were in the main Loyalists. The Presbyterians were in the main revolutionists. The revolutionist cause was often strongest in those colonies, such as Connecticut, where the Church of England was weakest. But the division was far from being a strict one. There were even members of the Church of England in the Boston Tea Party, and there were Presbyterians among the exiles who went to Canada and Nova Scotia. The Revolution was not in any sense a religious war, but religious differences contributed to embitter the conflict, and doubtless made Whigs or Tories of people who had no other interest at stake. It is commonly supposed that the Loyalists drew their strength from the upper classes in the colonies, while the revolutionists drew theirs from the proletariat. There is just enough truth in this to make it misleading. It is true that among the official classes and the large landowners, among the clergymen, lawyers, and physicians, the majority were Loyalists, and it is true that the mob was everywhere revolutionist. But it cannot be said that the Revolution was in any sense a war of social classes. In it father was arrayed against son, and brother against brother. Benjamin Franklin was a Whig. His son, Sir William Franklin, was a Tory. In the valley of the Susquehanna, the Tory Colonel John Butler, of Butler's Rangers, found himself confronted by his Whig cousins, Colonel William Butler and Colonel Zeb Butler. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams were not inferior in social status to Sir William Johnson, Thomas Hutchinson, and Joseph Galloway. And, on the other hand, there were no humbler peasants in the revolutionary ranks than some of the Loyalist farmers who migrated to Upper Canada in 1783. All that can be said is that the Loyalists were most numerous among those classes which had most to lose by the change, and least numerous among those classes which had least to lose. Much labour has been spent on the problem of the numbers of the Loyalists. No means of numbering political opinions was resorted to at the time of the Revolution, so that satisfactory statistics are not available. There was, moreover, throughout the contest a good deal of going and coming between the Whig and Tory camps, which makes an estimate still more difficult. "I have been struck," wrote Lorenzo Sabine, "in the course of my investigations with the absence of fixed principles, not only among people in the common walks of life, but in many of the prominent personages of the day. Alexander Hamilton, for instance, deserted from the Tories to the Whigs. Benedict Arnold deserted from the Whigs to the Tories. The Loyalists themselves always maintained that they constituted an actual majority in the 13 colonies. In 1779 they professed to have more troops in the field than the Continental Congress. These statements were no doubt exaggerations. The fact is that the strength of the Loyalists was very unevenly distributed. In the colony of New York they may well have been in the majority. They were strong also in Pennsylvania, so strong that an officer of the Revolutionary Army described that colony as the enemy's country. New York and Pennsylvania, wrote John Adams years afterwards, were so nearly divided, if their propensity was not against us, that if New England on one side and Virginia on the other had not kept them in awe, they would have joined the British. In Georgia the Loyalists were in so large a majority that in 1781 that colony would probably have detached itself from the revolutionary movement, had it not been for the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. On the other hand, in the New England colonies, the Loyalists were a small minority, strongest perhaps in Connecticut, and yet even there predominant only in 1 or 2 towns. There were in the 13 colonies, at the time of the Revolution, in the neighborhood of 3,000,000 people. Of these it is probable that at least 1,000,000 were Loyalists. This estimate is supported by the opinion of John Adams, who was well qualified to form a judgment, and whose Whig sympathies were not likely to incline him to exaggerate. He gave it as his opinion more than once that about 1/3 of the people of the 13 colonies had been opposed to the measures of the Revolution in all its stages. This estimate he once mentioned in a letter to Thomas McKean, Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, who had signed the Declaration of Independence, and had been a member of every Continental Congress from that of 1765 to the close of the Revolution, and McKean replied, "You say that about 1/3 of the people of the colonies were against the Revolution. It required much reflection before I could fix my opinion on this subject; but on mature deliberation I conclude you are right, and that more than 1/3 of influential characters were against it." End of chapter 2. Recording by Roger Moline.